Welcome to my channel.
The rain in the northwest Highlands does not fall at attacks. It drove horizontally across Lockdub, a grey, relentless assault that blurred the line between the sky and the cold, choppy waters of the sea loch. It was a day discouraging ambition. PC Hamish Macbeth, the sole policeman for the district, was a man who needed very little discouragement in that department. Hamish sat in his small, cosy police station, which was also his homesteading with watery hazel eyes, at the telephone on his desk. It was ringing with a persistent, nagging rhythm that suggested HQ in Strathbane was on the other end, likely looking to complicate his life with unnecessary paperwork. To Hamish, work was something to be avoided, a necessary evil that interrupted the true business of living, which involved looking after his small flock of black-faced sheep, his unruly mongrel, Tozer, and his orange and white cat, Sonsi. The phone gave one final, petulant jangle and fell silent. Hamish sighed with relief, running a large, freckled hand through his shock of fiery red hair. He got up from his desk, a tall, lanky figure in a somewhat threadbare uniform that hung loosely on his frame, and walked to the window. Outside, the village of Lockdub was battered down against the gale. The whitewashed cottages along the front street looked damp and discouraged. Down by the pier, Hamish's small boat bobbed precariously. His intention, early that morning, had been to accidentally drop a line near the mouth of the river, hoping for a salmon that the landlord, Colonel Halberton Smythe, would never miss. But time had stolen this little pleasure from him. "Right then, Tozer," Hamish said to the large, scruffy dog sleeping soundly by the peat fire. "Since work refuses to leave me be, I'll go and find some breakfast." Tozer thumped his tail sleepily and didn't move. Sonsi, stretched precariously on the mantelpiece, opened one eye, deemed the situation unworthy of her attention, and closed it again. Hamish grabbed his cap, jammed it onto his head, and stepped out into the rain. He sloshed his way along the front to the Lockdub Hotel. It was too early for tourists, but not too early for Mrs. Anstruther, the formidable manager, to have the coffee pot on. Inside, the hotel was warm and smelled of frying bacon. A group of local fishermen was gathered by the bar, nursing halves of bitter and discussing the weather with the gloomy relish unique to the Scottish Highlander. Hamish was about to order his coffee, and a full Scottish breakfast-thipping Mrs. Anstruther would put it on his tab, which was already longer than Kirk's grocery bill when the door to the dining room swung open. A man strode in, and the atmosphere in the room immediately changed. He was a small, wire-thin man with a face that looked like it had been carved out of a sour apple. He wore an expensive, tailored tweed suit that somehow looked ridiculous on him, and he carried a silver-tipped cane, despite showing no signs of a limp. This was Alistair Finch. He was a Sassenachan Englishman who had recently moved to the area. He had purchased a derelict croft up in the glen above Lockdub, not for the purpose of farming, but to turn it into a writer's retreat. Finch viewed the locals with a mixture of amusement and contempt. He had already managed to insult Angus MacLure by offering to buy his prize-winning ram for a fifth of its value, told the postmistress, Mrs. Wellington, that her postal service was antiquated, and informed the minister that the sermons in Lockdub Kirk were dreadfully derivative. "Macbeth," Finch barked, spotting the policeman. He marched over, his voice sharp and penetrating, cutting through the low murmur of the fishermen. "I want to file a complaint." Hamish, who was mentally calculating how many fried eggs he could get away with, looked down at Finch with an expression of dopey indifference. "A complaint, is it, Mr. Finch? And what would that be about, then?" "Vandalism," Finch declared, striking the floor with his cane. "Someone, last night, took it upon themselves to rearrange the stones of the dry stone dyke at the entrance to my property. They formed—" "Words, Hamish asked, a slight twitch at the corner of his mouth. "Sassenach go home," Finch spat, his face flushing with anger. "And they spray-painted it in bright orange on my front door. This is a hate crime, Macbeth. Outrage. I expect an immediate and thorough investigation." Hamish looked at Finch, his gaze seemingly fixed on a spot slightly above the man's left ear. He scratched his chin. "Well now, orange is a very hard colour to paint over, to be sure. But as for investigation, dry stone dikes do collapse, you know. It's raining. And the sheep. Sometimes they collide in such a way that they look almost like letters." Finch's eyes narrowed. "Don't you patronize me, you rustic imbecile. The sheep did not spray-paint my door. I want you up there, right now, dusting for fingerprints." Hamish sighed. "We do not really have the high-tech equipment for the fingerprinting here in Lockdub, Mr. Finch, and the rain would have washed it all away by now. Anyway, it's a very clever rain, the Lockdub rain. It cleans as it destroys." "I see," Finch said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. You're lazy, just like the rest of them. Content to sit here and gormandize while your betters are harassed. Well, I'll tell you this, Macbeth. I will not be bullied by a lot of ignorant peasants. He turned on his heel, his cane clicking sharply on the polished floor, and marched out of the hotel dining room, leaving behind a silence that was rapidly filling with simmering resentment. Hamish looked after him, then turned to Mrs. Anstruther. I'll take that coffee now, Mrs. A, and maybe 3 of those eggs. It seems I might have a busy day ahead of me after all. As the dining room doors swung shut behind the irate Englishman, a collective exhale swept through the Lochdub Hotel. Mrs. Anstruther marched over to Hamish's table, her mouth set in a grim line, and slapped down a plate heavy with fried eggs, black pudding, and sizzling bacon. That man, she declared, wiping her hands on her apron, is a blight upon the glen, calling us ignorant peasants. I have half a mind to charge him double for his afternoon tea. Angus MacLure, nursing his bitterness by the bar, grunted in agreement. He threatened to report my dogs to the council for barking. Dogs! Barking in the countryside. The man has a heart made of jagged flint. Hamish nodded, his mouth happily full of bacon. He let the wave of local resentment wash over him, filing away the complaints. Alistair Finch had alienated every resident in record time, and making enemies of quiet people rarely ended well. Hamish finished his coffee, offered Mrs. Anstruther an apologetic smile in lieu of hard currency, and whistled for Tozer. Leaving the hotel, Hamish found the aggressive morning rain had ceased, replaced by a dense fog that crept off the sea loch and swallowed the village. It muffled sound and turned the cottages into ghostly silhouettes. This suited Hamish perfectly. He could take the long path up the glen at a snail's pace without anyone observing his lack of urgency. He trudged up the steep track toward Finch Croft, the damp fog clinging to his uniform. Tozer trotted ahead, sniffing the wet heather. Hamish was in no hurry. He expected to find the spray paint washed away and the dike suffering from mere gravity. He would write a short report, file it in a drawer he never opened, and return to his stove. But as the outline of the isolated stone croft loomed through the grey soup, Hamish felt an unwelcome prickle at the back of his neck. Tozer stopped abruptly, the hair along his spine standing up, and let out a low growl. "Quiet, you," Hamish muttered, though his own pace slowed. The entrance to the property was exactly as Finch had described. The stones of the dike had indeed been rearranged, though the fog made the crude letters difficult to read. More pressing, however, was the heavy oak front door of the croft. It stood wide open, a stark, gaping black hole against the pale stone. The bright orange spray paint on the wood was smeared, as if someone had frantically tried to wipe it away with a wet sleeve. Hamish sighed, a mournful sound. His peaceful afternoon was evaporating faster than mist in the morning sun. He stepped carefully over the muddy threshold, Tozer pressing close to his leg. Inside, the croft was entirely silent, devoid of the sharp energy its owner had projected just an hour earlier. "Mr. Finch?" Hamish called out, his soft Highland lilt echoing off the bare stone walls. There was no reply. He moved cautiously into the main sitting room, a space Finch had ostentatiously decorated with tartan rugs that no true Highlander would ever tolerate. The smell of expensive cigar smoke lingered in the damp air, mixed with something sharp and metallic. Then Hamish saw him. Alistair Finch was not shouting about peasants anymore. He was seated in a high-backed leather armchair facing the cold fireplace. He was completely naked, save for a fluffy pink tea cozy jammed firmly onto his head like a ridiculous woven crown. His eyes stared blankly at the soot-stained bricks. A silver-handled letter opener protruded violently from his chest. Hamish stared at the bizarre, humiliating tableau. He didn't rush to check the pulse. The angle of the blade and the stillness of the man made it entirely redundant. He simply stood there, his hands pushed deep into his pockets, feeling a profound sense of irritation. "Well, Tozer," Hamish murmured, looking down at his dog. "That is a terrible waste of a good tea cosy." He turned his gaze back to the dead Englishman. Someone in Lochdub had finally snapped. Worse than the murder itself was the inescapable fact that Hamish would have to call headquarters. By nightfall, the loud and insufferable Detective Chief Inspector Blair would arrive from Strathbane, trampling mud into Hamish Station, ruining his peace, and undoubtedly arresting the wrong person. Hamish sank onto a wooden stool, ignoring the crime scene protocols Blair so deeply cherished. He needed a moment of quiet before the storm of sirens broke over his village. He looked at Finch's absurd pink headgear and shook his head. The man had been a menace, but nobody deserved to meet their maker looking quite so daft. Hamish sighed, a mournful sound echoing in the cold, damp croft. Dragging his eyes away from the absurd pink tea cosy, He shuffled toward the black telephone sitting incongruously on a rustic desk. Picking up the receiver, he dialed police headquarters in Strathbane, his heart sinking with every click. When the dispatcher answered, Hamish reported the murder with the dull monotone of a man announcing a railway delay. Hanging up, he stoked the dying embers in the fireplace just enough to break the vicious chill, sat back down on his wooden stool, and waited. The thick fog swallowing Lochstub, pressed against the small windows, wrapping the crime scene in a suffocating grey blanket. 2 hours crept by. Tozer snored gently by Hamish's boots, blissfully ignorant of the dead man sitting mere feet away. Finally, the crunch of tyres on the gravel track shattered the silence. It was not the sleek roar of a high-end vehicle, but the wheezing, strained engine of a mud-splattered police van struggling against the steep Highland incline. The vehicle lurched to a halt outside, its doors flying open. "Macbeth! Where are you, you lanky streak of misery?" A voice bellowed through the mist. Detective Chief Inspector Blair stomped through the open doorway, his face the colour of a boiled beetroot, his heavy wool coat speckled with moisture. He was an aggressive man who treated every case in Lochstub as a personal insult designed to ruin his digestion. Close on his heels was the perpetually weary detective Jimmy Anderson. "I am right here, sir," Hamish said mildly, not bothering to stand up. "Just keeping an eye on things." Blair stopped dead, his eyes bulging as he took Alistair Finch. For a moment, the perpetually shouting Chief Inspector was struck dumb by the sheer indignity of the victim's final outfit. He stared at the naked flesh, the protruding silver-handled letter opener, and finally, the fluffy pink tea cosy perched jauntily on the corpse's head. "What in the name of all that is holy is this, Macbeth?" Blair roared, the veins in his thick neck throbbing. "Have you been tampering with the scene? Did you put that ridiculous thing on his head as a joke, you useless peasant?" "No, sir," Hamish replied, his voice soft and infuriatingly calm. "He was wearing it when I arrived. I thought perhaps it was a new English fashion, but the letter opener suggested otherwise. Don't you give me your cheek," Blair snapped, pulling a handkerchief from his pocket and mopping his sweating forehead despite the freezing temperature. "Anderson! Get the photographer in here! And you, Macbeth, get out of my way. You've likely trampled all over every piece of evidence within a 5-mile radius with your great, clod-hopping boots." Hamish obediently backed toward the kitchen doorway, though his sharp eyes missed nothing. He had already noticed there was no mud on the victim's bare feet, suggesting he had stripped inside the croft. He also noticed the faint scent of a specific, cheap lavender soap lingering beneath the cigar smoke, a scent not belonging to a man who wore tailored tweed. Blair stomped around the armchair, glaring at the corpse as if willing it to confess. "It is obvious what happened here," he declared to the room, his voice booming. "This Sassenach came up here throwing his money around, insulting the locals. Who was it he was arguing with this morning? You told the dispatcher he had a row down at the hotel." "He had words with several people, sir," Hamish said quietly. "But he specifically mentioned Angus MacLure." "MacLure!" Blair yelled triumphantly, snapping his thick fingers. "The miserable old crofter with the vicious dogs. The victim threatens the dogs. MacLure comes up here in a rage, stabs him, and puts a tea cosy on his head to mock him. It's a textbook. Anderson, get down to the village and drag MacLure out of whatever filthy pub he's hiding in. I want him in cuffs before my tea." "But, sir," Hamish murmured, scratching his head, "Angus MacLure is a deeply traditional man. He considers tea a woman's drink. And besides, the door was spray-painted." "Shut your mouth, Macbeth!" Blair snarled, rounding on him. "I am conducting a murder investigation, not hosting a debate society for village idiots. You are officially off this case. Go direct traffic, or whatever it is you do to pretend you earn a wage. Leave the real police work to the professionals." Hamish tipped his cap, his face a mask of lazy indifference. "As you wish, sir." He whistled for Tozer and stepped out into the damp, swirling fog, already planning his next move to quietly prove Blair wrong. The thick fog that had swallowed the glen was settling heavily over the village of Lochstub, muffling the gulls and wrapping the stone cottages in a damp embrace. Hamish Macbeth strolled down the steep track with a deliberate gait, hands thrust deep into his pockets, Tozer padding faithfully at his heels. To anyone watching through a misty window, the local policeman appeared entirely devoid of purpose, a red-haired idler with not a single pressing thought in his head. This was exactly how Hamish liked it. While DCI Blair was up at the croft, shouting himself hoarse and preparing to arrest a perfectly innocent crofter, Hamish was busy sorting the puzzle pieces. Angus MacLure was a stubborn man who loved his sheepdogs, but he was no murderer. He lacked the theatrical imagination required to strip a man naked, stab him, and crown him with a pink tea cosy. Furthermore, Angus smelled of wet wool and peat smoke. He did not smell of cheap lavender soap. Hamish's stomach gave a low rumble, reminding him that discovering a corpse had interrupted his digestion. He directed his leisurely steps toward the village post office and general store, operated by the formidable Mrs. Wellington. The bell above the door chimed a brassy note as he pushed inside, bringing a swirl of cold fog with him. The shop was a glorious jumble of tinned goods, local newspapers, and stale biscuits. Mrs. Wellington, a stout woman with an ear for every whisper in the parish, was sorting a pile of chaotic mail. She looked up, her sharp eyes fixing on Hamish's worn uniform. "Well, if it isn't the law," Mrs. Wellington announced, crossing her arms. "Should you not be up the glen catching the villain who did that in English? Jimmy Anderson just went tearing past here in his van, asking everyone where Angus MacLure is hiding." "Is he now?" Hamish murmured, eyeing a plate of dry fruit scones sitting near the till. "It is a terrible business, Mrs. Wellington. I am pretty exhausted from all the shock. It takes a toll on a man's constitution." Mrs. Wellington snorted, though her eyes softened. "You look as though a stiff breeze would knock you over, Hamish. I suppose Yow'll be wanting tea to settle your nerves. And a scone, seeing as they are from yesterday and going hard anyway. You are an angel of mercy," Hamish sighed gratefully, sinking onto a rickety wooden chair. Within minutes, he was nursing a steaming mug of sugary tea and methodically demolishing the scone. Tozer positioned himself under the counter, awaiting crumbs. Hamish took a slow sip, letting the warmth spread through his chest. "So, Blair thinks Angus did it," Mrs. Wellington sniffed, wiping the counter with a damp rag. "The man is a fool. Angus was down at the pier all last night, mending nets. He never went near that croft. Finch brought this on himself. Did you know he was receiving mysterious parcels?" Hamish paused, a crumb catching on his lip. "Parcels, you say?" "Plain brown paper, addressed in type." She leaned in conspiratorially. "He came in to collect one yesterday. Shoved it under his arm and ran out. He smelled awful, too. Like he'd been bathing in cheap toilet water." "What kind of scent would you say it was?" Hamish asked, his eyes gleaming with interest. "Lavender," she declared firmly. "That overpowering synthetic lavender they sell at the discount pharmacy in Strathbane. The cheap muck. I noticed it because it clashed terribly with his expensive cigar smoke. And there is something else. You know that bright orange spray paint on the door? Wee Peter told me he saw someone hanging around the hardware aisle in Strathbane 2 days ago, buying 3 cans of it. Someone from Lochdub." Hamish finished his tea in one gulp. "And did Wee Peter mention who this artistic soul might be?" Before she could answer, the shop door flew open. A breathless Jimmy Anderson stumbled in, his raincoat soaked. "Macbeth! Thank God. Blair is going mental. We cannot find Angus anywhere, and the chief inspector is threatening to have my badge if I don't produce him in 20 minutes. Hamish stood up slowly, brushing a stray crumb from his tunic. The puzzle was becoming far more interesting than a simple village grudge. He patted Tozer's head, formulated a quiet plan to misdirect Anderson, and stepped back out into the freezing Highland fog. Hamish looked at the frantic Jimmy Anderson and gave a slow, mournful shake of his head. "Now, Jimmy, if I were a man like Angus MacLure, and the great DCI Blair was hunting me like a stag on the hill, I would not be sitting in the middle of the village waiting for a pair of handcuffs. I'd be up by the old Sheelings, or perhaps hiding in the sea caves where the tide doesn't reach. Yow'll not find him by driving that van up and down the front street like a maniac." Anderson groaned, wiped the condensation from his spectacles, and hurried back out into the mist, presumably to waste another hour scouring the shoreline. Hamish, however, had no intention of chasing Angus. He knew exactly where the old crofter was, likely in the back room of the curry shop, sharing a quiet dream with Labhoo while the world went mad outside. Instead, Hamish turned his footsteps toward the imposing gates of Castle Halberton. The fog was thinning slightly, revealing the jagged peaks of the mountains that stood like silent sentinels over the loch. He needed a different perspective, one that understood the world Alistair Finch had come from, a world of money, status, and the sharp, brittle edges of the upper class. As he walked up the long gravel driveway, the sound of a high-performance engine purred behind him. A sleek silver Rover pulled up alongside, and the window slid down to reveal the cool, aristocratic beauty of Priscilla Halberton Smythe. "Hamish," she said, her voice like silk over gravel. "I heard the news. The village is buzzing like a disturbed hive. Is it true that tea is cosy?" Hamish leaned against the car door, removing his cap to let the damp air cool his forehead. "It is, Priscilla. Pink with knit flowers. Not exactly the Crown Mister. Finch imagined for himself when he moved to the Highlands." Priscilla killed the engine and stepped out, her movements graceful and deliberate. She looked at Hamish with those clear blue eyes that always made him feel a little more like a useful peasant, and a little less like the master of his own destiny. He was a dreadful man, Hamish. My father couldn't stand him. He tried to buy the shooting rights to the West Moor last week, and when Popper refused, Finch threatened to sue over an ancient boundary line. They began to walk toward the castle gardens, the damp gravel crunching beneath their feet. Tozer trotted ahead, sniffing the manicured hedges. He was more than just arrogant, Priscilla continued, pulling a pair of leather gloves from her pocket. He was desperate. I saw him at the hunt ball in Strathbane a fortnight ago. He wasn't there to socialize, he was cornering people in the cloakroom, looking for investors for his writer's retreat. He mentioned a silent partner, someone local who was providing the authentic Highland atmosphere for his brochures. Hamish paused, his hazel eyes sharpening. A local partner? He didn't seem the type to share the credit, or the profits. Exactly, Priscilla said, stopping by a stone fountain. And he was arguing with a woman. I didn't see her face, but she was wearing a very distinctive scent, something cloying and cheap. It stood out because everyone else was drenched in Chanel or Joy. Hamish felt the pieces of the puzzle shift and click. Lavender? He asked softly. Priscilla nodded, a small frown marring her perfect brow. Yes, lavender, like a Victorian grandmother's linen cupboard, but synthetic. It was quite jarring. She looked at Hamish, her expression softening. You don't think Angus did it, do you? Hamish shook his head. Angus wouldn't know a writer's retreat from a hole in the ground, and he certainly wouldn't wear lavender soap. This is something else, Priscilla, something petty and hidden behind a curtain of respectability. Priscilla reached out and touched his arm, a gesture that always sent a jolt through him, though he fought to keep his face a mask of indifference. Be careful, Hamish. Blair is looking for a scapegoat, and if you get in his way, hell have you transferred to Glasgow before the week is out. Hamish smiled, a slow, deceptive lilt to his lips. I've no intention of going to Glasgow, Priscilla. The air is too thick and the coffee is terrible. I'll just keep mooching around until the truth decides to come out of the fog. As he walked back down the driveway, the smell of lavender seemed to haunt the damp air. He wasn't thinking about Angus Maclure anymore. He was thinking about the invisible people of Lochstob, the ones who cleaned the houses, delivered the mail, and watched the wealthy outsiders with silent, simmering resentment. Hamish left the grandeur of the castle behind, his mind whirling with the scent of synthetic lavender and the image of a desperate Alistair Finch cornering guests in a cloakroom. The fog had lifted further, revealing the cold, slate-grey waters of the loch, but the atmosphere in the village remained thick with tension. As he reached the police station, he saw the Strathbane police van parked haphazardly across the pavement. Inside, the muffled roar of DCI Blair's voice suggested that the professional investigation was reaching a boiling point. Hamish stepped inside, Tozer trailing cautiously behind him, to find a scene of utter chaos. Blair was standing over a trembling Angus Maclure, who had finally been located in the back of the curry shop and dragged in for questioning. The old crofter looked small and bewildered, his flat cap clutched tightly in his weathered hands. I'm telling ye, Inspector, Angus pleaded, his voice cracking. I was mending the nets. Ask Lab who, ask the boys. I haven't been up the glen since the sheep shearing. Blair slammed his fist onto the desk, sending a stack of Hamish neglected reports fluttering to the floor like wounded birds. Lies! We found the orange paint, Maclure. A half-empty can stashed right behind your potting shed. You hated Finch, you threatened him in public, and then you went up there and finished the job in the most insulting way possible. Hamish stood in the doorway, his tall frame leaning against the jamb, looking for all the world like a man who had accidentally wandered into the wrong room. The orange paint, is it, sir? Hamish asked mildly. Blair spun around, his face a dangerous shade of purple. Stay out of this, Macbeth. I've got him. The evidence is irrefutable. We found the can, and we found a pair of muddy boots in his porch that matched the tracks outside the croft. Hamish scratched his ear, his hazel eyes drifting toward the evidence bag on the table. It is a very popular shade of orange, to be sure. But Angus, did you not tell me last week that Youd lost the key to your potting shed? Angus nodded vigorously. Aye, Hamish. Someone forced the lock 3 days ago. I thought it was just the local loons looking for a place to smoke. Blair let out a sound like a steam engine reaching its limit. A forced lock, the oldest excuse in the book. He's going down, Macbeth, and I am taking him to Strathbane tonight. Hamish didn't argue. He knew that contradicting Blair in this mood was like trying to stop a landslide with a tea strainer. Instead, he walked over to the evidence bag containing the muddy boots and squinted at them. He then looked at Angus' feet. Those are fine boots, Angus, Hamish remarked. Size 10, I say. Angus blinked. I'm a size 8, Hamish. Always have been. My feet haven't grown since the coronation. The silence that followed was heavy. Blair looked from the boots to Angos' feet, then back to the boots. They were clearly far too large for the diminutive crofter. "It's a trick!" Blair bellowed, though the conviction in his voice had wavered slightly. "He used bigger boots to throw us off the scent. He's cunning, this one." Hamish sighed, reaching down to pick up a stray piece of paper that had fallen from the desk during Blair's tantrum. It wasn't a report, it was a small, crumpled receipt that must have been caught in the tread of the evidence boots. He smoothed it out carefully. It was a receipt for a luxury cat boarding kennel in Inverness, dated 3 days ago. "Angus," Hamish said softly, "do you own a pedigree Siamese cat?" Angus looked insulted. "I have 3 collies and a terrier that would eat a cat for breakfast. What would I be doing with a fancy creature like that?" Hamish handed the receipt to a stunned Jimmy Anderson. The red herring of Angus MacLure was disintegrating, leaving Blair with nothing but a pair of oversized boots and a face full of embarrassment. Hamish knew the real killer had planted that paint in those boots, counting on Blair's predictable arrogance to do the rest. The killer was someone who knew the village well, someone who knew Angus' shed was easy to access, and someone who likely had a very specific, very expensive pet. "Well, sir," Hamish said, his voice dripping with deceptive sympathy, "it seems we have a bit of a mystery on our hands after all. If you'll excuse me, I think I'll go and check on the postmistress. She was feeling a bit poorly earlier." Blair didn't answer, he was too busy snarling at Anderson to get the boots out of his sight. Hamish stepped back out into the cool evening air, his mind moving away from the obvious suspects and toward the people who moved through Lochdub unnoticed. The hidden motive was beginning to take shape, and it had nothing to do with sheep or dry stone dikes. The cool evening air was a welcome relief from the suffocating atmosphere of the station, where Blair was still shouting at the furniture in a desperate attempt to maintain his dignity. Hamish walked slowly, his long legs eating up the distance toward the outskirts of the village, away from the hotel and the pier. The receipt for the Siamese cat was burning a hole in his pocket, a tiny scrap of paper that pointed away from the rugged world of crofters and toward a much more refined sort of desperation. He remembered now that there was only one person in the parish who treated a cat like royalty, and it wasn't a wealthy English outsider or a local fisherman. He found himself standing outside a neat, pebble-dashed cottage with a garden that was perhaps a little too perfect for the rugged Highland landscape. This was the home of Mrs. Gilly, the village's most sought-after cleaner and domestic assistant. She was the invisible force that kept the holiday homes of the Sassenachs pristine and the linens of the local gentry crisp. She was a quiet, mousy woman who moved through the village like a shadow, someone everyone saw but no one truly looked at. As Hamish approached the gate, the scent of lavender that cloying, synthetic lavender Priscilla, had mention drifted on the damp breeze, emanating from the laundry hanging on the line. Hamish leaned over the fence, watching Mrs. Gilly through the kitchen window. She was scrubbing a pot with a ferocity that seemed at odds with her diminutive stature. He signalled for Tozer to stay, and then tapped gently on the glass. Mrs. Gilly jumped, her face pale as a sheet of parchment, before she recognized the red hair and the easy, deceptive smile of the local policeman. She opened the door, her hands trembling as she wiped them on a floral apron. "Mr. Macbeth," she said, her voice thin and high, Is there news about poor Mr. Finch? The village is saying Angus has been taken in." "He was, Mrs. Gilly, he was," Hamish said, stepping into the warm, lavender-scented kitchen. "But the boots were the wrong size. Horrible oversight by Strathbane detectives. They forget that Highlanders have a variety of feet." He sat at the small kitchen table without being asked, his eyes roaming the room. On the windowsill sat a framed photograph of a sleek, haughty Siamese cat wearing a rhinestone collar. "That's a beautiful creature," Hamish remarked. "It must be expensive to keep a cat like that in the manner she's accustomed to." Mrs. Gillis' face twisted into a mask of bitter resentment, the mouse-like demeanour vanishing in an instant. "She's all I have, Hamish, and Alistair Finch was going to take her from me. He was going to take everything." The words poured out of her like water from a burst dam. She explained how Finch had convinced her to invest her life's savings money shed painstakingly scraped together from decades of scrubbing Florcinto, his writer's retreat. He had promised her a partnership, a way out of her life of domestic servitude, but she had discovered the truth. The retreat was a sham, a front for Finch to settle his gambling debts in London. There was no partnership, no future, and when she had confronted him, he had laughed at her, calling her an ignorant peasant who should be grateful he'd even looked at her. "He told me I'd never see a penny back," she hissed, her eyes bright with a dangerous light. "He said I could go back to cleaning his toilets for all he cared." He was going to sell the croft and vanish. Hamish listened in silence, his heart heavy. It wasn't about the money for Mrs. Gilly, it was about the humiliation of being duped by a man she had served. The murder hadn't been an act of cold-blooded greed, but a final, desperate strike against a man who had treated her like furniture. The tea-cosy, Hamish realized, wasn't just a bizarre detail, it was the ultimate insult from a woman whose life revolved around the domestic rituals of the people who looked down on her. She had stripped him of his dignity because he had tried to strip her of her future. And the orange paint, Mrs. Gilly? Hamish asked softly. She looked away, her shoulders sagging. I thought if I made it look like a village grudge, like one of the men had done it, they'd never think of me. Nobody ever thinks of the woman who does the washing. She sat opposite him. The fight finally went out of her. The hidden motive was bare, a petty, human cycle of jealousy and social embarrassment that had ended in a cold room with a silver letter opener. Hamish knew he had the truth, but the arrest would be the hardest part of the job. He reached out and patted her hand, his expression one of genuine, grounded empathy. Hamish sat in the silence of Mrs. Gilly's kitchen, the ticking of a wall clock sounding like the slow march of a funeral procession. He looked at the woman's shaking hands and felt a wave of that peculiar Highland weariness. He had the confession, but a confession in a kitchen without witnesses was a fragile thing, easily shattered by a clever lawyer or a sudden change of heart. More importantly, if he simply marched her down to the station now, Blair would take the credit, claim he had broken the suspect, and Hamish would find himself being measured for a new sergeant's uniform in a smog-choked city. He needed Mrs. Gilly to reveal herself in a way that left no room for doubt, and he needed Blair to look like a fool in the process. "Mrs. Gilly," Hamish said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, "there is something you should know." DCI Blair is convinced it was Angus MacLure. He's found the paint, the boots, and he's even found a witness who says they saw Angus leaving the croft. He watched her eyes. They widened, a flicker of hope competing with the guilt. "But," Hamish continued, leaning in closer, "there is one problem. The letter opener. It's a very rare antique. Finch told the insurer it was part of a matched set. The police in Strathbane think the killer took the second one's matching dagger and hidden it somewhere nearby. This was a lie, a pure fabrication of the sort Hamish used to navigate the murky waters of village life, but he saw it hit its mark." Mrs. Gillis' gaze darted toward the photograph of the Siamese cat. "The matching one?" she whispered. Hamish nodded solemnly. "Ha!" "Blair is sending a specialized search team with metal detectors tomorrow morning. They are going to search every garden and shed within a mile of the village. If they find that second blade, the person holding it will go to Peterhead for the rest of their natural life." Hamish stood up, smoothing his tunic and adjusting his cap. "He'll be off now. I have to go and help Blair set up the search perimeter. It's a pity, though. If the killer was smart, they'd realize that the evidence is only dangerous if it's found on their property. If it were to appear somewhere else, tonight'd say, in the boot of Blair's own police van, the whole case would fall apart in a mountain of procedural errors." He gave her a long, steady look, the kind of look that suggested he was far stupider than he actually was. "Good night to you, Mrs. Gilly. Try to get some sleep. The metal detectors make a terrible racket." He stepped out into the night, Tozer following with a confused whimper. The fog had returned, thick and cold, clinging to the stone walls like a wet shroud. Hamish didn't go back to the station. Instead, he circled around the back of the village, moving through the shadows of the peat stacks until he reached the darkened alleyway behind the Lochdub Hotel, where the police van was parked. He found a vantage point behind an old cider barrel and settled in to wait. The trap was simple. He had exploited Mrs. Gilly's panic and her belief that he was a lazy policeman who had inadvertently given her a way out. Inventing the missing dagger, he had forced her hand. She couldn't risk the metal detectors, and she couldn't resist the chance to frame the man who was currently persecuting the village. In her mind, planting the evidence on Blair was the ultimate revenge on the system that had ignored her. An hour passed. The only sound was the lock's distant turn against the pier and the occasional rustle of Tozer's fur. Then, a figure emerged from the mist. It was a small, shrouded shape, moving with the practiced silence of someone who spent their life moving through other people's houses. The figure reached the back of the police van, their breath hitching in the cold air. Hamish watched as Mrs. Gilly pulled a heavy, cloth-wrapped object from beneath her coat. She reached for the handle of the van's rear door, which Blair, in his arrogance, never bothered to lock while in his territory. As the door creaked open, the interior light flickered on, illuminating her pale, desperate face. She went to shove the bundle inside, but her hand froze. From the darkness of the van's interior, a pair of hazel eyes looked back at her. Hamish had been sitting in the back of the van for 20 minutes, his long legs cramped against the spare tyre. "I believe you're looking for a place to put that, Mrs. Gilly," Hamish said softly, his voice echoing in the confined space. The woman let out a strangled cry, the bundle slipping from her fingers and clattering onto the metal floor. As the cloth fell away, it revealed not an antique dagger, but a pair of blood-stained gloves and a small, empty bottle of synthetic lavender oil. The trap had snapped shut, and for the first time that day, the Highland silence felt absolute. Mrs. Gilly stood frozen in the pale, flickering light of the police van's interior, her breath hitching in a series of sharp, jagged sobs. The sight of Hamish Macbeth sitting calmly amidst the crates of forensic equipment was too much for her fragile nerves to bear. For a moment, she looked as though she might simply collapse into the damp gravel of the alleyway. But then a different look crossed her face, look of a cornered animal, realizing that the stupid policeman had been playing with her all along. Her small, bird-like hands curled into claws, and her eyes flashed with a sudden, desperate ferocity. "You!" she hissed, her voice trembling with a mixture of hatred and terror. "You and your tea and your gormless smiles. You are like everyone, Macbeth. You think because I scrubbed the floors and washed the muck off your boots that I don't have eyes. I saw what he was doing. I saw the way he looked at us, like we were nothing more than the dirt under his expensive shoes." Hamish slowly climbed out of the van, his movements fluid and surprisingly graceful for a man of his height. He stood before her, his head nearly touching the rusted metal of the van's roof. "I know you saw it, Mrs. Gilly," he said, his voice a low, soothing murmur that carried through the fog. "But killing a man won't wash the insults away. It only brings a different kind of darkness into the glen. Now, why don't you just come with me? We'll go inside, and we'll talk about the cat and the money, and we'll make it right." But Mrs. Gilly was past the point of reason. She let out a high, thin wail and suddenly lunged forward, not toward Hamish, but toward the open door of the van, reaching for the heavy iron jack stored in the side panel. Hamish moved with a speed that would have shocked DCI Blair. He caught her by the wrists, his grip firm but careful, pinned her against the side of the vehicle. She struggled with a surprising, wiry strength, kicking at his shins and trying to sink her teeth into his hand. It was a messy, undignified scuffle, the kind that never made it into the glossy police procedurals. "Now then, Mrs. Gilly, that's enough of that," Hamish panted, his cap falling into the mud as he manoeuvred her toward the station door. "You'll only hurt yourself, and there's no one to look after the Siamese if you're all bruised and battered." The cat's mention seemed to drain the last of the fight from her. Her body went limp, and she began to weep with a hollow, gut-wrenching sound that echoed off the stone walls of the hotel. Hamish guided her through the back entrance of the police station, steering her away from the main office, where Blair was likely still nursing his wounded ego. He placed her in a chair in the small, cramped interview room, the one with the peeling wallpaper and the smell of stale tobacco. He didn't lock the door, he simply stood by it, looking down at the broken woman. Outside in the hallway, the sound of heavy footsteps announced the arrival of the chief inspector. The door burst open, and Blair stormed in, his face a vivid shade of crimson, followed by a wide-eyed Jimmy Anderson. "What is the meaning of this, Macbeth?" Blair bellowed, his eyes darting from the weeping woman to the blood-stained gloves Hamish had placed on the table. "I told you to stay out of my investigation. Who is this woman, and why is she in my station?" Hamish looked at Blair, his expression one of vacant, helpful innocence. "This is Mrs. Gilly, sir. She was just coming by to confess, I suppose." It seems the guilt was too much for her to carry. She had these gloves in her possession, and she was very keen on telling me all about the orange paint and the tea cosy. It appears she felt Mr. Finch was not quite the gentleman he claimed to be. Blair's mouth opened and closed like a landed fish. He looked at the evidence, then at the suspect he had completely overlooked in favor of a local crofter. The realization that he had nearly arrested the wrong man, while the true killer was literally cleaning his own office at headquarters, began to dawn on him. He turned his glare back to Hamish, sensing that he had been outmaneuvered, but unable to prove how. "A confession, eh?" Blair growled, stepping forward to loom over Mrs. Gilly. "Well, it's about time someone did some real police work around here. Anderson, get the tape recorder. I'll handle the interrogation from here. Macbeth, get out. You've done quite enough damage for one day." Hamish tipped an invisible cap, picked up his muddy headgear from the floor, and whistled for Tozer. He walked out of the station and into the cool, cleansing air of the Highlands, leaving the shouting and the paperwork behind. He had one more task to perform, one final piece of the game to play, to ensure that his life in Lochdub remained exactly as it was. Hamish stood on the gravel path outside the station, listening to the muffled roar of DCI Blair's voice through the stone walls. Inside, the chief inspector was busy reinventing history, already framing his interrogation of Mrs. Gilly as a masterclass in detective intuition. Hamish leaned against the cold trunk of a rowan tree, the damp bark soaking into his tunic, and let out a long, slow breath. The danger now was not the murderess was safely under Blair's heavy thumb but the looming threat of success. If the official report stated that PC Macbeth had single-handedly tracked the killer, navigated a complex motive of financial fraud, and set a flawless midnight trap, the brass in Strathbane would be descending upon Lochstub with a promotion and a transfer order to a grey, congested precinct in Glasgow. He watched through the window as Jimmy Anderson emerged from the interview room, looking drained. Hamish pushed himself off the tree and intercepted the younger detective near the police van. "A long night, Jimmy," Hamish said softly, his voice full of sympathetic weariness. Anderson rubbed his eyes. "Blair's in there acting like he personally discovered the lavender scent and the cat receipt. He's already drafting the press release in his head. It's not right, Hamish. You're the one who sat in the back of that freezing van. You're the one who found her." Hamish put a large fatherly hand on Anderson's shoulder. "Now, Jimmy, let's look at the bigger picture. If I take the credit, he'll be dragged off to some city where the only grass grows between the paving stones. He'll have a sergeant's stripes, aye, but he'll lose my sheep, my boat, and my peace. And what about you? You've got a family to think of. A bit of commendation for assisting a brilliant DCI would go a long way toward that raise you've been hoping for." Anderson hesitated, the conflict clear on his face. Hamish leaned in, his hazel eyes fixed with deceptive sincerity. "Tell the chief inspector that you were the one who noticed the lavender oil. Tell him you suggested we stake out the van because you suspected the killer might try to plant evidence. He'll just be the simple village bobby who happened to be there to hold the door open." A slow smile spread across Anderson's tired face. "You're a strange man, Hamish Macbeth. Most people would give their right arm for a promotion." Hamish chuckled, a low, dry sound. "Most people haven't tasted the air in Lochstub on a clear spring morning, Jimmy." He watched Anderson return to feed Blair's insatiable ego. A few minutes later, the door to the station swung open, and Blair marched out, looking as though he had personally liberated a small country. He spotted Hamish and stopped, his chest puffed out like a prize pigeon. "Well, Macbeth," Blair barked, though the usual venom was replaced by a smug, condescending triumph. "We've got it all wrapped up. A tidy bit of work. Anderson here tells me he had a few sharp ideas about the lavender, and I, of course, saw through that Gilly woman's mousy act the moment I stepped into her kitchen. It takes a certain level of professional experience to crack a case this layered. You'd do well to study the transcripts." Hamish tipped his cap, his face a mask of humble admiration. "It is a marvel to watch the professionals at work, sir. I was just happy to be of some small assistance with the heavy lifting. I suppose he'll be staying here, then. To handle the local paperwork while you take the glory, I mean. The suspecto Strathbane?" Blair snorted, already climbing into the passenger seat of the van. "Stay here? Of course Yow'll stay here. You're barely fit for the quiet life, let alone the rigours of a real station. He'll make sure the super knows you didn't get in the way too much. Come on, Anderson. We've a long drive, and I want a celebratory steak before the canteen closes." The van lurched into gear, spraying a fine mist of gravel as it roared away from the station and toward the main road. Hamish stood in the middle of the road, watching the red taillights vanish into the Highland mist. He was alone again, the silence of the village returning like a comforting old friend. The threat of promotion had been successfully averted, buried under the weight of Blair's vanity and Anderson's ambition. He whistled for Tozer, who emerged from the shadows with a wagging tail, and together they turned back toward the small, whitewashed station that was Hamish's sanctuary. The heavy rumble of the police van faded into the distance, replaced by the rhythmic shush of the Atlantic swell against the Lochstub pier. The village felt lighter, as if the departure of DCI Blair's ego had physically lifted a weight from the atmosphere. Hamish stood on the front street for a long moment, breathing in the scent of wet peat and salt earth, only perfumes a man truly needed. The orange spray paint on Alistair Finch's door would eventually be scrubbed away, and the tea cosy would end up in a cardboard evidence box in Strathbane, but for now, the Highlands had reclaimed their quiet. He walked back to the station, his boots clumping rhythmically on the road. Inside, the fire had burned to a few glowing embers. Tozer immediately reclaimed his spot on the hearthrug, letting out a long, contented sigh as he settled his chin on his paws. Sonsi, the cat, remained perched on the mantelpiece, her golden eyes judging Hamish for his long absence. Hamish ignored her critique and moved toward the small kitchen area. He filled a heavy iron pot with water and set it on the stove, the clatter of the lid sounding like a final punctuation mark on the day's events. While he waited for the water to boil, he reached into the cupboard and pulled out a tin of expensive coffee, a gift from Priscilla months ago that he had been saving for a moment of genuine peace. As the rich, dark aroma began to fill the room, Hamish felt the tension of the investigation drain out of his lanky frame. He sat at the kitchen table, the wood scarred by years of use, and pulled a small, crumpled envelope from his pocket. It was the parson's portion of the story that Blair would never know. Inside was a handwritten note Mrs. Gilly had tried to swallow during the scuffle. It wasn't a confession, but a simple list, a series of dates and figures representing the money Finch had systematically drained from her. Beside it lay a small, silver-plated whistle that had belonged to Finch. Hamish flicked the whistle into his hands. It was a petty thing, a tool used to summon servants or dogs, a symbol of the arrogance that had led to the man's end. With a practiced movement, Hamish tossed the whistle into the back of a junk drawer filled with old keys and fishing laws. The law would deal with Mrs. Gillis' crime, but Hamish would make sure the solicitors dealt with the estate. He would send a quiet word to a certain lawyer in Strathbansomione who owed him a favorto, ensure the sale of the croft paid back every penny to the invisible people Finch had cheated. The kettle began to whistle, a cheery domestic sound that stood in stark contrast to the scream Mrs. Gilly had let out in the alleyway. Hamish poured the water over the grounds, watching the steam rise in a fragrant cloud. He took his mug and wandered back to the window, looking out over the loch. The moon was beginning to break through the clouds, casting a silver path across the water. He was still a PC, his salary was still a pittance, and his uniform was still fraying at the cuffs. To the world outside, he was a failure, a man with no ambition who had let a loud-mouthed superior steal his thunder. But, as he sipped hot, bitter coffee, Hamish Macbeth smiled. He was exactly where he wanted to be. He had his sheep, his dog, his cat, and his home. The Sassenach was gone, the village was safe, and most importantly, the threat of a promotion to Glasgow was buried deep under the mountain of Blair's vanity. "Well, Tozer," Hamish murmured, the dog's ears twitching at the sound of his voice. "It's a grand thing to be a useless peasant in a place like this." He blew out the lamp, the room falling into a soft amber glow provided by the dying peat fire. Tomorrow he would go poaching for that salmon head missed out on this morning. After all, the colonel wouldn't miss it, and a man had to eat. As the silence of the Highland night settled over the station, Hamish Macbeth closed his eyes, perfectly content to be the smartest man in the room that no one ever noticed.